Good morning. This is Environmental Intelligence, Episode 10 for March 12, 2026, your daily briefing on environmental regulatory, science, and compliance developments that matter for Canadian professionals. Ontario's fast-tracking of Great Bear Mine permits under the Mining Act faces Grassy Narrows lawsuit, signaling risks for mining assessments in the province. Ontario's advancement of the Great Bear gold mine despite pending litigation over the Mining Act and water permits under the Environmental Protection Act creates immediate uncertainty for mining proponents conducting environmental assessments, requiring reviews of Indigenous consultation obligations. A California Water Board rule on dairy nitrate pollution may influence CCME guidelines or provincial water quality standards in agricultural regions like Alberta and Ontario. Professionals should monitor federal Canada Gazette notices this week for any related consultations on mining or water regulations. Let's start with the lead today, which is the ongoing challenge to Ontario's Mining Act in the context of the Great Bear gold mine. Grassy Narrows First Nation has filed a lawsuit targeting the Mining Act, specifically RSO 1990, Chapter M14, along with a water permit issued under OREG 38704 for water taking and transfer. The core allegations center on inadequate Indigenous consultation and insufficient environmental protections, building on previous legal challenges in the province. For context, this isn't isolated. It's part of a pattern where mining approvals face scrutiny for failing to meet consultation standards. Compare that to BC's EMA, where First Nations engagement is embedded in mining approvals through Protocol 13 risk assessments, or Alberta's EPEA Part 2, which mandates similar considerations in mine site remediation planning. In Quebec, under the LQE, mining permits explicitly require contaminant transport modeling, which adds a layer of rigor that Ontario's process sometimes lacks. What's happening here is the Doug Ford government pushing forward with fast-tracking. This is the third project to get that treatment, potentially compressing the usual 18 to 24-month assessment timelines. But that speed comes at a cost, heightened litigation risks that could lead to delays in site development or even compliance orders from the courts. Practitioners working on mining ESAs in Ontario need to audit their files for alignment with Fisheries Act Section 35(1), which protects against habitat disruption. It's also worth cross-referencing with federal IAA triggers, especially for projects over 5,000 tons per day or production. What I find interesting here is the potential for broader precedents. If this lawsuit progresses, and it could escalate to the Supreme Court, it might influence SARA compliance across jurisdictions, pushing for more interprovincial harmonization. In practice, this means updating risk registers for your Ontario mining clients to account for possible court-imposed stays. It's a reminder that fast-tracking might save months up front but could add years if consultation gaps aren't addressed. Shifting to regulatory and policy watch, there's movement on the water quality front from California that could ripple into Canadian frameworks. The California State Water Resources Control Board is preparing to release a new rule aimed at curbing nitrate pollution from dairies, focusing on excess nitrogen leaching into groundwater with thresholds potentially below 10 mg/L nitrate N to prevent seepage into waterways. This stands in contrast to CCME's Canadian Water Quality Guidelines, which set 45 mg/L nitrate for aquatic life protection, or Ontario's OREG 16903 under the EPA, where controls on agricultural runoff are less prescriptive. In Alberta, EPA's Tier 1 guidelines for nitrate in soil, say 200 mg/kg for commercial sites, might feel the influence if federal CPA amendments start incorporating U.S.-style nutrient management plans, particularly for dairy operations on the prairies. For Saskatchewan, this ties into MPA requirements for manure storage, where similar nutrient loading issues could prompt tighter rules. What this signals is a possible push for CCME review cycles to adopt comparable limits, affecting 2027 compliance reporting for sites with historical fertilizer use. Keep an eye on federal Canada Gazette notices this week for any consultations that might link to this. On the spill response side, the Sarnia oil spill at a Suncor facility warrants a quick note, even if it's not a full regulatory shift. Containment efforts using booms and vacuum equipment align with Ontario EPA protocols under OREG 67598, but if hydrocarbon sheens reach the St. Clair River, expect Fisheries Act investigations, much like federal oversight in BC's CSR for petrochemical sites. Looking at the regulatory calendar, federal CPA toxic substances list consultations close on March 25, 2026, so get your submissions in on proposed additions like certain PFAS analogs. This directly impacts site assessments under BC CSR Protocol 6. Ontario's EPAO. Regidor 15304 has an annual reporting deadline for record of site condition filings on April 1, 2026, which means updating any Phase 2 ESAs from Q1. In Alberta, EPA remediation certificate applications for oil sands sites hit a March 31, 2026 milestone for Tier 2 risk assessments, tying into CCME soil quality guidelines. And CCME's guideline review for petroleum hydrocarbons kicks off April 5, 2026, with input periods that could shape Manitoba Environment Act compliance. Cross-jurisdictionally, track that California dairy nitrate rule for its potential to influence CCME water quality updates. Nutrient loading in the Canadian prairies mirrors this, possibly leading to tightened thresholds under the Federal Fisheries Act or Quebec's LQE. Also, the U.S. EPA's PFAS Strategic Roadmap for 2026 proposed drinking water standards might harmonize with Health Canada's maximum acceptable concentrations, like 0.2 UG/L for PFOA, affecting lab accreditation and treatment tech such as granular activated carbon in Ontario and BC. Finally, EU REACH amendments on microplastics could impact CPA 2024 import regulations for polymers, requiring Canadian importers to audit supply chains by Q2 2026. Turning to science and technical developments, the California Dairy Rule brings some practical insights for remediation designs here in Canada. It highlights the use of permeable reactive barriers for nitrate attenuation, with efficacy rates of 70 to 90% based on UCPA data. This could prompt labs to validate ISO 17025 methods for lower detection limits, such as 0.05 mg/L via ion chromatography, especially for groundwater monitoring in agricultural contaminated sites. Tying into that, the Ontario mining context reinforces the need for robust contaminant transport modeling in ESAs, similar to Quebec's LQE requirements. If you're dealing with nitrate or similar pollutants, compare these to provincial equivalents like Saskatchewan's EMPA for manure storage. It's a straightforward way to anticipate shifts in thresholds. The details aren't fully clear yet on the California thresholds, but here's what we know. They're aiming below 10 mg/L nitrate N, which is more stringent than CCME's 45 mg for aquatic life. In industry and practice, with spring fieldwork on the horizon, it's time to prep groundwater monitoring for contaminated sites. Make sure your sampling plans account for seasonal high water table fluctuations, following BC CSR Protocol 1 for well installation depths, and Alberta EPA requirements for quarterly VOC analysis via GCMS with MDLs below 0.5 UG/L. Calibrate equipment for PFAS-free sampling to avoid cross-contamination, drawing on USEPA method 537.1, and integrate climate adaptation by mapping flood risk zones per IAA guidelines that prioritizes resilient monitoring networks for high vulnerability sites. This is routine prep, but skipping it could complicate compliance, especially if you're tying into CCME's upcoming review on petroleum hydrocarbons. For action items today, if you're handling mining ESAs in Ontario, review the Mining Act litigation and update Indigenous consultation templates to mitigate delays. Compare the California dairy nitrate thresholds to CCME guidelines and adjust groundwater models for agricultural sites in Alberta or Ontario. Audit spill response plans for Ontario petrochemical facilities against EPAO, Reg 67598, incorporating lessons from the Sarnia incident. Prepare submissions for CPA consultations closing March 25th, focusing on PFAS implications for risk assessments, and update spring monitoring protocols to include flood risk mapping per federal IAA, targeting high vulnerability sites. Looking at the week ahead, March 15th, 2026 marks a Federal Impact Assessment Agency webinar on IAA amendments for mining projects relevant to Ontario and BC practitioners. March 18th, 2026 is the close of Alberta EPA consultation on updated Tier 1 soil guidelines for metals, which will affect remediation designs. March 22nd, 2026, brings a CCME virtual meeting on PFAS analytical methods, discussing ISO 17025 updates for labs across jurisdictions. And March 25th, 2026, is the deadline for feedback on proposed Fisheries Act habitat protection enhancements, with overlap to provincial EPAs. Before we wrap, tomorrow, watch for more on the Federal Impact Assessment Agency webinar set for March 15th, which could clarify IAA amendments impacting mining assessments in Ontario and BC. That's environmental intelligence for March 12th, 2026. If this briefing is useful to your practice, share it with a colleague and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We're back tomorrow. Have a productive day.